The hearing room was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of floor wax and fear. Dr. Eris Thorne stood before the Federal Water Resource Board, a single glass vial in her hand. Inside was nothing more than a few grams of dark, loamy soil from her family's farm. Across from her, flanked by a team of sleek, merciless lawyers, sat Marcus Thorne. He was the undisputed king of the Cinderwood Valley, a man whose wealth was so vast it had its own gravitational pull, warping the laws of man and nature to his will. He looked at her not with anger, but with the bored indifference of a god contemplating an ant. He had crushed her father, bled the valley dry, and used the law itself as his cudgel. He believed this hearing was a mere formality, the final swatting of a persistent fly. He and everyone else in that room believed her land was worthless, her science was a fantasy, and her fight was already lost. Nobody knew that the vial in her hand contained a universe, a silent microscopic army that had already won the war. Nobody knew that the dirt they dismissed as dead was about to pass judgment. This is a true story of how a woman with nothing but a doctorate in mycology and a mountain of debt used the hidden power of the earth itself to shatter a corporate empire and resurrect a valley that had left her for dead. The call had come on a Tuesday, a day Eris had always associated with the dull thud of pointless meetings and lukewarm coffee. Her father, John Thorne, was dead. A heart attack, the doctor said, massive and immediate. But Eris knew better. Her father's heart hadn't failed. It had been methodically, systematically crushed over the course of a decade. She packed a single bag, walked out of her sterile, promising biotech lab in the city without a word to anyone, and drove the 5 hours back to the Cinderwood Valley, the valley she had sworn she would never return to. As she crested the final hill, the view that had once filled her with a sense of boundless belonging now felt like a punch to the gut. The Thorne farm, once a patchwork quilt of vibrant green orchards and golden wheat fields, was now a monochrome study in brown and gray. The soil looked like cracked porcelain, the trees like skeletal fingers clawing at a merciless sky. Her father hadn't just lost a farm, he had presided over a funeral. The farmhouse was a museum of grief. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, illuminating the ghosts of happier times. A faded photograph on the mantelpiece showed her father, younger, his face weathered but lit with a genuine smile, his arm around a much younger Eris. He was holding a prize-winning apple, its skin a perfect, lustrous red. Now, the orchards were barren, the trees choked by blight and neglect. The very air in the house felt thin, suffocated by the weight of failure. For 2 days, Eris moved through the silence, sorting through the artifacts of a life defined by a slow, grinding defeat. She found stacks of unpaid bills, threatening letters from suppliers, and a ledger book whose columns bled red ink like an open wound. The farm wasn't just failing, it was a corpse, and the vultures were already circling. The official confirmation of her inheritance of ruin came a week later in the frigid, marble-floored lobby of the Cinderwood Valley Bank. The bank manager, a man named Peterson with a starched collar and eyes like polished river stones, slid a folder across his mahogany desk. He didn't bother with condolences. He spoke in the clipped, dispassionate language of finance, a dialect designed to strip all humanity from human suffering. The numbers were staggering, a monument to her father's desperation. Multiple loans, refinanced, consolidated, leveraged against every last acre, every piece of rusting equipment, every drop of water in their well. Foreclosure wasn't a possibility. It was a date on a calendar, 90 days away. The land's productivity has collapsed, Peterson stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. Frankly, Dr. Thorne, the asset valuation no longer supports the debt. The farm, as it stands, is worthless. As if summoned by the scent of financial carrion, Marcus Thorne appeared at the farm the next day. He wasn't just a distant cousin, he was a different species. He arrived in a black luxury sedan that seemed to suck the very light out of the air, its engine a low, predatory purr. He was a big man, his expensive suit doing little to hide a lifetime of hearty meals and absolute authority. He was the sole owner of Thorn Agricorp, the behemoth that sold the valley its seeds, its fertilizers, its pesticides, and then bought back its harvests at prices he alone dictated. He had methodically acquired a dozen other failing farms in the valley, and now he had come for the ancestral heartland. He walked the dead land with Eris, his polished shoes crunching on the desiccated soil. He offered his condolences for John, his voice a rich, syrupy baritone that felt more insulting than silence. Then he made his offer, a lowball figure, barely enough to cover a fraction of the bank debt, presented as an act of charity. "Let me take this burden off your shoulders, Eris," he said, placing a heavy hand on her arm. "Your father was a good man, but he wasn't a modern farmer. This land needs a firm, practical hand." His eyes, however, weren't looking at the dead soil. They were looking past it, toward the shimmering line of the Cinder Creek, the last significant independent water source in the valley. He wasn't buying a farm, he was conquering a kingdom. Eris looked from Marcus's patronizing face to the parched earth at her feet. She saw the predatory gleam in his eye, the same gleam she'd seen in the eyes of corporate raiders during her brief stint in the private sector. It was the look of a predator that had already tasted blood and knew the kill was certain. Something inside her, a cold, hard knot of grief and rage that had been tightening for a week, finally snapped. She pulled her arm away. "The Thorn Farm isn't for sale, Marcus." The words were quiet, but they landed in the silence with the force of a slammed door. Marcus's practiced mask of sympathy vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine surprise, which quickly hardened into annoyance. He chuckled, a condescending rumble in his chest. "Don't be sentimental, girl. There's nothing left here to save." But Eris wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the ground, at the intricate network of cracks in the baked clay. He saw death. She, a mycologist, saw a dormant world waiting for a signal to awaken. "You're wrong," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You see dead dirt, I see a battlefield, and you're not winning this one." The idea had been germinating in the back of her mind for years, a theoretical solution to a global problem that was now her intensely personal crisis. It was the core of her doctoral thesis, the subject of her most passionate and controversial research. The world, and men like Marcus Thorn, saw soil as an inert medium, a thing to be filled with chemical inputs to produce a yield. They were profoundly, fundamentally wrong. Eris knew that healthy soil was not a substance. It was a living, breathing superorganism, a subterranean city teeming with billions of microscopic citizens. The most important of these were the mycorrhizal fungi. These were not the mushrooms you saw on the forest floor, but a vast, invisible network of gossamer threads, called hyphae, that formed a symbiotic partnership with plant roots. The fungi acted as a biological internet, a circulatory and nervous system for the earth itself. They could stretch a plant's root system 1,000-fold, mining for water and locked up nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen far beyond the plant's own reach. In return, the plant fed the fungi sugars created through photosynthesis. It was the planet's oldest and most successful partnership. Thorn Agricorp's chemical fertilizers and pesticides had been a poison, a chemical blitzkrieg that had shattered this ancient alliance, killing the fungi and leaving the plants as helpless, dependent junkies. Her plan was not to treat the farm, it was to resurrect it. She would become a god of this tiny, dead world, reintroducing the spark of life. She would use her remaining savings to custom culture a hyper-resilient strain of mycorrhizal fungi, a cocktail of species specifically adapted to the valley's clay soil and arid conditions. She would then create a liquid slurry and, using a modified subsoiler, inject it directly into the compacted hardpan, bypassing the dead topsoil and delivering her microscopic army straight into the root zone. It was a massive, insane gamble. It was slow, it was organic. It required faith in a process that was invisible and, to most people, utterly alien. It was the complete antithesis of Marcus Thorne's model of instant chemical-fueled gratification. It was, she knew, her only shot. To get the capital for even a scaled-down version of her plan, she needed a loan, a partner, anything. Her first and only stop was the monthly town hall meeting held in the musty community center. It was a gathering of the defeated. The faces of the other farmers were etched with the same lines of worry and exhaustion she'd seen on her father's. They were all trapped in Marcus Thorne's web, their debts mounting, their yields stagnating. When her turn came to speak, Eris stood at the podium and laid out her plan. She spoke with the passion of a scientist and the desperation of a daughter. She talked about hyphae and mycelial networks, about nutrient cycling and water retention. She showed them slides from her research, microscopic images of the beautiful, intricate fungal threads enveloping a root hair. The room was silent. When she finished, the silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Then, from the back, a single, sharp snort of laughter. It was a catalyst. A ripple of chuckles spread through the room, then grew into open, derisive laughter. They looked at her like she was a lunatic, a city slicker academic babbling about magic dirt. Then Marcus Thorne, who had been leaning against the back wall like a feudal lord observing his serfs, stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "With all due respect to the doctor," he began, the words dripping with condescension, "we are farmers here, not mystics. We deal with soil, not souls." He smirked. "What she's proposing is hippie nonsense. Dirt worship. While she's down on her knees praying to her mushrooms, the bank will be taking her farm." The laughter that followed was louder this time, harsher. It was the sound of a community choosing a familiar tyrant over an unknown savior. Eris stood at the podium, her face burning, her proposal and her hope turning to ash in her mouth. She had been publicly, humiliatingly dismissed. The message was clear. She was alone. There was one person in the room who hadn't laughed. An old man sitting by himself near the exit, his face a road map of hard miles, his hands gnarled and stained with grease. His name was Silas. He was a drifter, a mechanic, a jack of all trades who had been in and out of the valley for 40 years. He was considered an outcast, a man who answered to no one, least of all Marcus Thorne. The next morning, as Eris was staring at the rust bucket tractor her father had left behind, wondering how she could possibly begin, Silas's beat-up truck rattled up her driveway. He got out, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and squinted at the tractor. "That ain't gonna run," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Eris replied, her voice flat with defeat. Silas walked over, popped the engine cover, and peered inside. "Needs new plugs, fuel filters shot, and the carburetor's gummed up tighter than a banker's fist." He looked at her, his pale blue eyes surprisingly sharp. "Heard you at the meeting last night. They're fools. My granddaddy used to talk about the land being alive. Said we killed it." He kicked at a clod of hard earth. "Reckon you're the first person in 30 years who's talked about bringing it back." He then made her an offer. He'd work for room and board and a small share of the harvest, if there ever was one. "I ain't got nothing better to do," he grumbled, "and I'd surely like to see the look on Marcus Thorne's face if you prove him wrong." With Silas's help, Eris made her all-in bet. She liquidated everything she had, her retirement account, her stocks, the small city apartment she'd been renting. She sold her father's old hunting rifles and a few pieces of antique furniture her mother had cherished. It was a pittance, but it was enough. She spent nearly all of it on the concentrated fungal spores from a specialty lab and on the raw materials Silas needed to build their inoculation rig. He was a mechanical genius, a virtuoso of scrap metal and sheer ingenuity. He took the farm's ancient, derelict subsoiler and, with a welder and parts scavenged from a dozen different junk heaps, transformed it into a strange, steampunk contraption. It was a series of hollow tines connected by a web of hoses to a large tank mounted on the back. It was ugly, temperamental, and loud, but it was theirs. It was the tool of their resurrection. The work was brutal, a penance paid in sweat and pain. From the first hint of dawn until the last vestiges of light faded from the sky, they crawled across the dead fields. Aris drove the roaring, bucking tractor, a machine she quickly learned was a temperamental beast, prone to fits of rage and sullen silence. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate precision of lab equipment, were soon raw with blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. The dust coated her skin, her hair, the inside of her mouth, a constant gritty reminder of the deadness she was fighting. Behind her, Silas rode the inoculation rig, wrestling with the levers that plunged the tines deep into the unyielding hardpan, injecting their precious, life-giving slurry into the suffocating earth. They were a two-person army waging a silent, desperate war against a dead planet. Each acre was a victory, each chugging roar of the tractor a battle cry. They had been at it for 2 weeks, making agonizingly slow progress when the first attack came. They rose one morning to a dead silence. The generator that powered their water pump was usually a constant, reassuring thrum in the background. Now, it was quiet. Silas opened the fuel tank and the sickly sweet smell of sugar hit them like a physical blow. The engine was ruined, a crystallized mess of useless metal. It was sabotage, clean and deniable. There were no footprints, no witnesses, but it had Marcus Thorne's signature all over it. It was a calculated strike at their most critical vulnerability. The fungal spores, now in the ground, were dormant. They needed water to awaken, to begin their slow, miraculous work of weaving the earth back together. Without it, they would simply die, and Eris's entire investment, her entire gamble, would turn to dust. Despair washed over Eris, cold and absolute. For a moment, she felt the same crushing weight that must have broken her father. It was hopeless. He was too big, too powerful. But then she looked at Silas, who was staring at the ruined generator not with despair, but with a quiet, simmering fury. And that fury was contagious. It burned away her fear, leaving behind something harder, something colder, sheer, unadulterated rage. "He's not winning," she said, the words like chips of ice. Not like this. The desperate response was born of that rage. Silas remembered a rusty, forgotten 500-gallon water tank sitting in a scrapyard, and an old flatbed truck her father had owned that hadn't run in a decade. While Silas, with a magician's touch, cannibalized parts and breathed life back into the truck's engine, Iris remembered the small, artesian spring at the far northern edge of their property. It was a place her father had called sacred, a trickle of water that had never, in living memory, run dry. It was too small for large-scale irrigation, but it was water. It was life. What followed were 3 days and nights of manic, sleepless effort. It was a Sisyphean task, an act of pure, defiant will. They would drive the lurching, groaning truck up the rugged track to the spring, use a small gas-powered pump to slowly fill the tank, then drive it back down and painstakingly irrigate a small section of the inoculated fields. Then they would do it again and again. The roar of the truck's engine, the whine of the pump, the splash of water into the tank became the rhythm of their existence. They worked under the blistering sun and the cold, indifferent stars, fueled by black coffee, adrenaline, and a shared, unspoken vow to not be beaten. On the second night, Eris saw headlights pause on the main road, watching them. She didn't hesitate. She walked back to the farmhouse, retrieved her father's old 12-gauge shotgun, and sat on the porch, the weapon heavy and cold across her lap, until the headlights moved on. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a guardian, a soldier defending a nascent world. Weeks turned into a month. The back-breaking water hauling gave way to a tense, expectant quiet. Every morning Eris would walk the fields, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The ground remained a barren, cracked expanse. The mockery from the town hall echoed in her ears. Marcus Thorne's smug face loomed in her memory. She had gambled everything on an invisible, microscopic process. Doubt began to creep in, a cold poison. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was all just hippie nonsense. Then, one morning, she saw it. A tiny speck of impossible green against the dull brown. She dropped to her knees, her breath catching in her throat. It was a clover sprout, no bigger than her fingernail, pushing its way through a crack in the soil. And there was another, and another. She ran her fingers over the ground. The soil, which had been as hard and unforgiving as concrete, now had a slight give. It was softer, more friable. She dug her fingers in and brought a clump to her nose. The dry, dusty smell was gone, replaced by a rich, sweet, loamy scent. It was the smell of life. She began to laugh, a raw, choked sound that was half sob. It was working. The miracle was happening beneath her feet. As spring bled into the punishing heat of a Cinderwood Valley summer, an old enemy returned with a vengeance. Drought. It was a slow, creeping disaster. The skies remained a cloudless, pale blue day after day. The Cinder Creek, the valley's lifeblood, began to shrink. Upstream, the massive reservoir behind Marcus Thorne's private dam was full, but he released only a trickle of water, just enough to keep his own showcase fields green while squeezing the rest of the valley. The conventional farms, with their shallow-rooted, chemically addicted crops, began to suffer. The corn yellowed, the leaves of the fruit trees curled and crisped at the edges. The vibrant greens of the valley faded to a sickly, desiccated brown. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that shimmered over the land, pressing the life out of everything. But on the Thorne farm, something astonishing was occurring. While the rest of the valley withered, Eris's fields became an oasis. The cover crops she had planted, a mix of clover, vetch, and hardy grasses, were not just surviving, they were thriving. Their roots, supercharged by the burgeoning mycelial network, were diving deep into the subsoil, tapping into moisture reserves the other farms couldn't reach. The fungal network was acting like a vast, subterranean sponge, capturing every molecule of water from the morning dew and the rare brief showers, and distributing it throughout the fields. The land was healing itself from the inside out. The cover crops protected the soil from the sun's relentless assault, creating a cooler, more humid microclimate at ground level. Wildflowers, unseen for decades, began to erupt in vibrant splashes of color, attracting a riotous buzz of native bees and pollinators. To conserve their precious spring water, Eris and Silas laid down a network of drip irrigation, a painstaking process of running thin hoses to the base of each of the old apple trees she was trying to revive. It was a heroic act of targeted hydration, giving each tree just enough to survive, a personal plea for it to hold on. They worked in the oppressive heat, their clothes perpetually soaked with sweat, their bodies pushed to the edge of endurance. But every evening, as they watched the sun set, they could see the result of their labor. Their farm was an island of defiant, vibrant life in a dying sea. The spectacle did not go unnoticed. The change was so dramatic, so stark, that it became a local phenomenon. The same farmers who had laughed at her now drove slowly down the road bordering her property, their trucks silent, their faces a mixture of disbelief and envy. They saw the lush green, the explosion of wildflowers, the clouds of pollinating insects. They saw life where, by all rights, there should be death. The mockery had curdled into a grudging, fearful respect. Eris Thorne's dirt worship was working, while their modern, scientific methods were failing catastrophically. The tide of public opinion, if not turning, was at least beginning to slacken. They weren't her allies yet, but they were no longer her enemies. They were simply watching and waiting. Marcus Thorne was also watching. Her success was not just an anomaly, it was an existential threat. Her farm was a living, breathing refutation of his entire business model. If a farm could thrive without his patented seeds, his chemical fertilizers, his expensive pesticides, then his empire was built on a lie. He could no longer dismiss her as a foolish girl. He couldn't beat her with sabotage or drought. Nature, it seemed, was on her side. So he escalated, shifting the battle from the physical world to a realm where he was the undisputed master, the labyrinth of bureaucracy. He would not break her body or her farm. He would break her spirit with the soul-crushing power of the state. The attack came on a Monday morning. A pristine white truck with the State Department of Agriculture logo on the side rolled up the driveway. The man who stepped out was named Jennings. He was tall, thin, and had the weary, disinterested air of a man who was just doing his job. He had a sheaf of papers and an official order to take soil and water samples. He claimed it was a random, valley-wide inspection for agricultural contaminants. Eris knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was anything but random. She watched as he moved through her fields, his movements precise and methodical, bagging samples of the rich, dark earth she and Silas had fought so hard to resurrect. He was polite, professional, and utterly implacable. When he left, a sense of profound dread settled over the farm. 3 days later, the official notice arrived by certified mail. The envelope felt heavy in Eris's hand, a harbinger of doom. She read the letter, her blood turning to ice. The lab report, it claimed, had found evidence of a rare and highly aggressive soil-borne pathogen, a fictional blight with a terrifyingly scientific name. Pursuant to State Agricultural Code 7, Section 4, her farm was placed under immediate and total quarantine. The words were a legal cage, slamming shut around her. All transport of agricultural products, equipment, and even soil from the property was strictly forbidden. All sales were to cease immediately. A violation would result in massive fines and potential criminal charges. The quarantine was indefinite, pending further investigation. It was a death sentence, delivered by a bureaucrat. Her harvest, which was only weeks away and promised to be a bumper crop, was now legally worthless. She could not sell it. She could not move it. She could only watch it rot in the fields. The bank's 90-day clock was about to strike midnight, and Marcus Thorne had just ensured she would have no income to stop it. This was the checkmate. Her scientific knowledge was irrelevant. The vibrant health of her farm was inadmissible evidence. She was trapped in a nightmare of paper and ink, a world where a lie on an official letterhead was more powerful than the living truth beneath her feet. She could appeal, of course. The letter helpfully outlined the process, a multi-stage bureaucratic gauntlet that would take months, if not years, to navigate. By then, the bank would have foreclosed, and Marcus Thorne would own the land. He had found the perfect weapon, a crisis that her grit, her ingenuity, and her deep understanding of the natural world were utterly powerless to solve. For the first time, Eris felt the true, soul-crushing despair that had claimed her father. She sat on the porch, the quarantine notice trembling in her hand, and stared at her thriving, beautiful, legally dead farm. The despair lasted for 24 hours. It was a thick, suffocating fog. But as the sun rose on the second day of her legal internment, the fog began to burn away, replaced by the cold, clear light of pure fury. She would not let her father's legacy and her own life's work be extinguished by a lie in a filing cabinet. She was a scientist. A lie was just a hypothesis waiting to be disproven. She and Silas turned the farmhouse kitchen into a war room. They would not fight the quarantine head-on. That was a battle designed for them to lose. They would attack its foundation. They would investigate Marcus Thorne, the Inspector Jennings, and the entire corrupt ecosystem that had allowed this to happen. Men like Thorne, Silas said, his voice a low growl. They don't get that powerful by playing fair. There's bodies buried somewhere. We just gotta find them. Silas started by talking to old-timers, dredging up the ghosts of the valley's past. He mentioned the rumors that had always swirled around Marcus Thorne's initial rise to power 3 decades ago. Stories of how he had consolidated control over the valley's water rights with astonishing speed. The stories were vague, whispers of predatory deals and legal sleight of hand that had left a handful of old farming families destitute. It was smoke, but Eris knew that where there was smoke, there was fire. The mention of water rights triggered a memory. Her father, in his last few years, he had become obsessive, withdrawn. He spent hours locked in his office, poring over old maps and documents. She had thought it was a symptom of his depression, a retreat into the past. Now, she wondered if it was something more. His office was exactly as he had left it, a dusty sanctuary of organized chaos. And in the corner, beneath a pile of old farming almanacs, was a heavy locked footlocker. Eris had never seen it open. It took Silas half an hour with a crowbar and a hammer to pry the rusted lock apart. What they found inside made the air leave Eris's lungs. It was not a retreat into the past. It was an investigation. Her father, in his quiet, methodical way, had been building a case against Marcus Thorne for years. There were dozens of files filled with his neat, precise handwriting. He had cross-referenced old county deeds with state water allocation records. He had photocopied historical survey maps from the university library. He had documented, with meticulous detail, a pattern of deception and fraud going back 30 years. And at the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in oilcloth, was the hidden truth. It was a copy of the original 1908 Federal Cinderwood Valley Water Charter. It was the founding document that had established the legal framework for all water rights in the region. Eris read the brittle, yellowed paper, her hands shaking. The language was archaic, but the meaning was crystal clear. The charter, in order to protect the valley from a single entity ever monopolizing its most vital resource, had designated 5 specific artesian springs as inalienable public trust resources. These springs and the small creeks they fed were to remain accessible to all residents of the valley forever. They could not be bought, sold, or dammed. One of the 5 springs listed, identified by its precise geographical coordinates, was the very spring on her property, the one that had saved her farm. Marcus Thorne's entire water empire, his dams, his reservoirs, his control over the Cinder Creek, was predicated on his ownership of all primary water sources. But this document proved his claim was a fraud. He had systematically bought up the land around these protected springs and then buried their legal status, effectively privatizing a public resource. He hadn't just cheated a few farmers. He had committed a massive, decades-long federal crime. Her father had found the dagger, but he had died before he could plunge it in. As Eris was absorbing the magnitude of her father's discovery, the phone rang. It was Peterson, the bank manager. His voice was strained, nervous. He asked to meet, somewhere public. They met in a booth at the back of the town's only diner. Peterson looked terrible. He was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched his coffee cup. He confessed everything in a hushed, frantic whisper. The quarantine had been the last straw for him. He told Eris that Marcus Thorne held a controlling interest in the bank through a series of shell corporations. For years, Thorne had been using the bank as his personal weapon, forcing it to extend predatory loans to farmers, then pressuring the bank to foreclose at the slightest sign of trouble. Thorne would then buy the distressed assets from the bank for pennies on the dollar through another one of his companies. It was a perfectly legal, perfectly vicious cycle of manufactured ruin. Peterson had been a willing participant, but the brazenness of the quarantine, the targeting of a farm that was visibly thriving, had shaken him. "He's not just a businessman," Peterson stammered. "He's a predator, and I'm afraid of what he'll do to me if I'm found to be a part of it." His conscience, or more likely his instinct for self-preservation, had finally won. He slid a flash drive across the table. "These are the records," he said. "Every transaction, every shell company, every farm he's swallowed. It proves a pattern of racketeering. Use it, please. Just leave my name out of it until you have to." Eris now held two smoking guns. Her father's research was the historical crime, the foundational fraud upon which Thorne's empire was built. Peterson's flash drive was the modern crime, a detailed ledger of his predatory racketeering. She had evidence of state-level financial crimes and a massive federal water rights violation. She realized then that going to the local authorities would be a fatal mistake. Thorne owned them. This was bigger. This was federal. She had one chance to present her case, and it had to be before an authority even Marcus Thorne couldn't corrupt. The final confrontation took place not in a courtroom, but in the hushed, wood-paneled hearing room of the Federal Water Resource Board's regional office. Eris had bypassed the state entirely, using her academic contacts to secure an emergency hearing on the basis of a federal charter violation. Marcus Thorne was there, summoned by a federal subpoena. He looked annoyed, not worried. To him, this was a bureaucratic nuisance. His lawyers, a pack of polished sharks, whispered confidently beside him. Eris stood alone at the petitioner's table. She began not with the water charter, but with the quarantine. She placed the single vial of her farm soil on the table. The state of Cinderwood has declared the contents of this vial to be a biohazard, she began, her voice steady and clear. They claim it contains a pathogen that has rendered my farm worthless and dangerous. She then presented the results of an independent analysis she had commissioned from her old university lab, express-mailed overnight. The results were projected on a large screen for the board to see. The truth, she continued, is that this soil contains one of the most vibrant and complex microbiological ecosystems in the entire state. It is not sick. It is, in fact, the picture of perfect health. The first crack appeared in Marcus Thorne's armor of indifference. His lawyers began to shuffle their papers nervously. Then, Eris produced her father's research. She laid out the old maps, the deeds, and finally, the copy of the 1908 Federal Water Charter. She explained its language, its intent, and its clear, unambiguous designation of 5 protected springs. She pointed to the coordinates of the spring on her property. Mr. Thorne has built a 30-year empire on the lie that he controls all the water in the Cinderwood Valley. He does not. He is in violation of a federal charter that has been in effect for over a century. His dams are illegal. His reservoirs are illegal. His entire control of the Cinder Creek is based on fraud. The room was utterly silent. The board members were leaning forward, their faces grim. Finally, she submitted Peterson's flash drive, along with a sworn notarized affidavit from the bank manager which she had convinced him to sign. And this, she said, her voice ringing with the cold fury of righteous justice, is the evidence of how he has leveraged that illegal control. A detailed account of financial racketeering and collusion, proving a multi-decade scheme to defraud the farmers of my valley. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne. The bored indifference was gone, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. He finally understood. This wasn't a nuisance. It was an execution. The empire shattered. The hearing concluded with the board immediately referring the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Federal investigators, armed with Eris's evidence, descended on the Cinderwood Valley like a righteous storm. Marcus Thorne was arrested, his face a mask of disbelief as he was led away in handcuffs. Thorne AgriCorp was frozen, its assets seized pending investigation. The corrupt state inspector, Jennings, was arrested. The fraudulent quarantine on Eris's farm was not just lifted, it was expunged, with a formal apology from the state. The federal government took control of Thorne's dams, and for the first time in 30 years, the waters of the Cinder Creek were fully released, flowing freely back into the parched valley. The drought had devastated every farm in the valley except one, Eris's farm. Protected by its living soil and the trickle from its newly liberated spring, was an explosion of life. The harvest was beyond anything she could have imagined. The apples from the revived heirloom trees were bursting with a flavor and nutrient density that modern, chemically grown fruit could not match. Her cover crops yielded a bounty of organic seeds and forage. The news of her miracle farm and the downfall of Marcus Thorne had spread. High-end organic grocery consortiums and elite restaurants, desperate for produce from the only thriving farm in a drought-stricken region, engaged in a bidding war for her harvest. The final contract she signed was for a sum so large it was almost comical. The sale of a single harvest, from land the bank had declared worthless just months before, was for more than the bank's own inflated valuation of the entire farmland, buildings, and water rights combined. The scene at the Cinderwood Valley Bank was one for the history books. Eris walked in, not as a desperate debtor, but as a conquering hero. She sat across from a humble, deeply grateful Peterson. She didn't just write a check to pay off her father's loan. With the backing of a new credit line secured by her massive harvest contract, she bought out the bank's entire portfolio of distressed agricultural debt in the valley. She became the lien holder for nearly every one of her neighbors. Then, in the stunned silence of the bank lobby, she looked at Peterson and dictated her terms. The loans were to be restructured, with interest rates slashed to near zero. The payment schedules were to be based on harvest cycles, not arbitrary calendar dates. There would be no more foreclosures in her valley. She wasn't just saving her farm, she was emancipating her community. A few years later, the Cinderwood Valley was unrecognizable. It had been reborn. Eris had established the Cinderwood Cooperative, a nonprofit dedicated to restoring the valley's soil. She shared her custom fungal cultures freely, teaching the other farmers the principles of regenerative agriculture. The valley had transformed from a brown, chemical-soaked dust bowl into a thriving, verdant landscape of small, resilient, and profitable organic farms. The co-op sold its produce collectively, commanding premium prices and ensuring that the wealth generated by the land stayed in the community. The town was alive again, its main street bustling, its people free from the economic servitude that had defined their lives for a generation. They looked at Eris not as an outsider, but as the woman who had listened to the land when they had forgotten how. They had once laughed at her, but now, with a kind of good-natured sheepish chuckle, they called her the valley's dirt doctor. One cool autumn evening, Eris stood with Silas on a hill overlooking the farm. The orchards were heavy with fruit, the fields a rich tapestry of green. The air was sweet with the smell of damp earth and ripening apples. She bent down and picked up a handful of soil. It was dark, crumbly, and teeming with invisible life. It was no longer a problem to be solved, but a partner to be cherished. She thought of her father, not with the old ache of his failure, but with a profound sense of gratitude. He had not lost the war. He had fought the first, lonely battle, gathering the intelligence and planting the seed of resistance that she had finally brought to bloom. He would have liked this, Silas said quietly, breaking the silence. He would have loved to see the land breathing again. Eris let the soil run through her fingers, a quiet, profound satisfaction settling deep in her soul. She had inherited a legacy of ruin, but she had transformed it into a legacy of renewal. She had listened to the silent, ancient wisdom of the earth, and in its language, she had found her voice, her victory, and her home.